Welcome everyone to week number 4 of our unit Planet Earth. This week we're going to be talking about something called weathering and erosion. What is weathering and erosion? Well, that's where we take a rock that looks kind of like this, and after we leave it for a little while, it can turn into something smooth and round just like that. So let's give it a try. Now, obviously it's going to take a little bit longer than that. We aren't going to be able to see those changes happen in a rock just by watching it in our lifetime. But let's consider a couple examples of weathering. I've got a few samples here that we can take a look at, but even after we finish talking about it today, a lot of you will notice that you'll see the effects of weathering and erosion all around you. So like I showed you before, right? If I start with just this, this plain old rock, there's not a lot that's really special about it. Now, in fact, you could say, right, it's smooth on the top, and it's smooth for a reason. Over time, right, like I showed you before, I can end up with a rock just like this. As I'm showing you this rock, right, it looks like it's just an egg. Like it's so smooth and round. And that doesn't happen just by accident. I can show you another example where I have this piece of rock here. Right, as we look at this, we can see that there's these kind of divots in this rock, right? And they follow this pattern, right? They're almost perfectly straight. Now, how does this happen? How do we end up with rocks that over time, right, starting out as just plain old piece of lithosphere essentially, right? How does it end up to have these different almost designs? They look like they were made on purpose. Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about weathering. Now, this week, I'm not going to be drawing on our whiteboard. We're going to get real high tech and I'm going to use my iPad. Alright, now on the back side of your handout, you're going to see a picture that looks just kind of like this, right? You're going to see a picture that looks just like this. But what I'm going to talk about first is we're going to take this rock. We're going to imagine this is the rock that we're starting with, okay? Now, over a long period of time, right, thousands if not millions of years, right, we can end up with a rock that looks a little bit different, right? And this is going to be our after rock. We're going to talk about 3 different kinds of weathering. Now, what is weathering? Well, weathering is just the breakdown of rocks by water, right, glacial ice, wind, waves. So, there's 3 different kinds of weathering that we're going to talk about. The first one is kind of the simplest one. So I'm going to draw it over on this side here. The first kind of weathering I'm going to talk about is called physical weathering, or you might hear it as mechanical weathering. Now, what physical or mechanical weathering is just the breakdown of rocks by physical forces, things like wind or water, right? So you can imagine if there's wind that's blowing on this rock, right, over a long period of time, well, it'll slowly start to take little pieces off of that rock. Right? Now you can't just blow on a rock and it just disintegrates, but over a long period of time and with enough strong winds, we can actually change the shape of a rock. Now same thing, we could cause that breakdown. So imagine that this water is flowing this way, right? It's kind of like if this rock was sitting in a river. Physical weathering. Alright, now that's only one kind of weathering. What about the second kind of weathering? Well, a second kind of weathering is called chemical weathering. And I'm going to draw that in this space right here. Now, what is chemical weathering? Well, you have to imagine that there's a difference between a physical change and a chemical change. A physical change is like if I just break a piece of wood in half. A chemical change, though, is where I light it on fire. And what's happening there is that there's actual changes going on in the molecular structure of that wood. Just like if I was burning wood, right, a chemical change in a rock is going to be a change in the actual molecules or the actual minerals of that rock. Could be something like acid rain. Well, what's acid rain? Well, that's where we have some things that are in the atmosphere will actually dissolve in water, okay? And then we end up with acid rain. Now, as that acid rain falls, it's going to fall onto our rock and it's going to cause changes. It's going to actually react with the minerals in that rock. Now another example is if we have, oxygen in water can actually cause changes. Just like oxygen in water can cause changes like rust in metal, right? It can form chemical changes on a rock as well. I'm just going to do a little burst here to show that there's some kind of chemical change going on inside of that rock. Now that's just 2 different kinds of weathering. Okay, we have physical or mechanical weathering, right, where we're just actually breaking it down. Our second one is chemical weathering, where we're actually having chemical changes to the rock, which is going to change it into something else. Or we can have what is called biological weathering. Now, if you imagine biological weathering, well, biology, that's the study of life. So biological weathering has to do with things that are living that are going to cause the weathering. So for example, if you've ever seen, trees or plants that are growing out of the side of a cliff, right? Oftentimes what those roots are doing is they're starting to break down the rock itself. We talked about an example of this even in our unit when we talked about succession, right? And now we have examples of pioneer species like lichen, which will first start to form on a rock because they can actually break down the rock itself into soil. We can draw a little plant that's starting to grow. But most importantly, this plant has some roots. And some of it are kind of crawling along on the outside, some are going on the inside of the rock, right, starting to break down this rock. So that's our three kinds of weathering: physical, chemical, and biological. So what do we end up with? Well, like we see here in this picture, we go from a rock that looks, kind of pointy with straight edges, and it gives us this rock over here. See how we have these kind of smoother edges? We're starting to have little bits fall off. Now what can happen with this? As we can see, there's chunks of the rock that are starting to fall off, right? For whatever reason, for one of those three different kinds of weathering. What if those pieces are falling off and those pieces actually get moved around? Well, those pieces, they can fall, right, wherever. And what we call that is sediment. Now, you've learned about sediment before. You learned about the rock cycle. There's three different kinds of rocks, and one of those is sedimentary rocks. And they're formed by all of this sediment falling and eventually forming back into another rock. Now, this sediment, right, as it's falling off of the rock or being blown off, right, that's erosion. Now, erosion is just when the products of weathering are moved from place to place. So as we imagine, as this rock is being weathered, it's being moved from place to place. Now, what if there was a river flowing nearby? Imagine we have this river, it's flowing this way, and what if some of this sediment started to fall in this river? Well, it's going to get pushed along in this river, and in either of these cases, see where we have some of the sediment is being laid down there, some of the sediment could be laid down on the bottom of the ocean. Well, this is what we call deposition. Now you might recognize a word in there, deposit, right? We are literally just depositing the products of weathering onto the ground, right? Or it could be, at the bottom of a river. So if we come back to our overview of the whole process, we have three different kinds of weathering: physical weathering, chemical weathering, and biological weathering. And all three of these will start to round off the edges of a rock, right? Starting to take little pieces off until we end up with a rock that looks a little bit more like this. And some of those pieces, as they get laid down, right, we call it sediment, and it's laid down through the process of deposition. Over time, as that sediment stacks up on top of more sediment, on top of more sediment, that's a process called sedimentation. And all of these terms are words that are found in your textbook that you can write definitions for in your vocabulary section to the left. So if I look back at this rock here, where we've got these divots in here, this rock could have started as just one flat side, but over time, as water was running through it, water could have caused this change in the rock. That's everything for week number 4. Good luck with the rest of your work this week.